The morning light streamed through the curtains as Sophie Chen sat at her old piano, her fingers dancing across the keys. The gentle melody of Chopin filled the small living room of her family's apartment. Sophie couldn't see the keys beneath her fingers, but she didn't need to. She had memorized every note, every movement since she was 5 years old. Sophie had been blind since birth, but her ears worked perfectly. Better than perfectly, according to her piano teacher, Mrs. Rivera. Sophie had what musicians called perfect pitch, the rare ability to identify or create any musical note without a reference tone. "Sophie, you'll be late for school," her mother called from the kitchen. Sophie's fingers paused mid-melody. She sighed and closed the piano lid gently. "Coming, Mom." At 17, Sophie was in her final year of high school. While other students her age dreamed about college and careers, Sophie dreamed only of music. But dreams, as her father often reminded her, didn't pay the bills. "You're playing beautifully this morning," her mother said as Sophie found her way to the kitchen table, one hand trailing along the wall, a path she knew by heart. "Thanks," Sophie replied, finding her seat and feeling for the bowl of oatmeal her mother had prepared. "I was working on the piece Mrs. Rivera assigned for next week." Her father's newspaper rustled as he lowered it. "You know, Sophie, I was thinking, maybe it's time to consider something more practical. The community college has excellent programs in—" "Dad," Sophie interrupted, a hint of frustration in her voice. They'd had this conversation too many times. "Music is practical for me," her father sighed. "I just want to make sure you can take care of yourself someday." "Let's not start the day with this discussion," her mother intervened, her tone gentle but firm. "Sophie has her lesson with Mrs. Rivera after school. We can talk about the future another time." The rest of breakfast passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional scrape of spoons against bowls and sips of coffee. Later that afternoon, Sophie sat on the familiar bench in Mrs. Rivera's studio, playing the final notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune. "Excellent technique, Sophie," Mrs. Rivera said when she finished, "but I feel you're holding something back. The notes are perfect, but music isn't just about hitting the right keys at the right time." Sophie nodded, her hands resting in her lap. "I know," Mrs. Rivera was quiet for a moment. "Sophie, how long have we been working together?" "Almost 12 years now. And in those 12 years I've watched you grow from a child plunking out simple melodies to a young woman with extraordinary talent. But lately I sense you've hit a wall, not in skill but in confidence." Sophie's fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sweater. "My dad thinks I should be more realistic about my future. That music should be a hobby, not a career path. Parents worry," Mrs. Rivera said. "It's in their job description. But sometimes they worry so much about the obstacles that they forget to see the possibilities." She paused. "Which brings me to something I've been meaning to discuss with you." Sophie heard the rustling of papers. "There's an international youth music festival happening in New York next month. Some of the best young musicians from around the world will be performing, and several renowned pianists will be attending as judges and mentors." Sophie's heart quickened. "That sounds amazing, but I submitted a recording of your spring recital performance," Mrs. Rivera continued. "And you've been accepted." Sophie's mouth fell open. "You what?" "But I can't." "You can, and you should," Mrs. Rivera said firmly. "Sophie, I've been teaching for 30 years. I've worked with hundreds of students, many with advantages you haven't had. But raw talent like yours is rare. You have a gift that deserves to be heard." Sophie shook her head, panic rising in her chest. "But performing in front of all those people in a strange place and those judges, one of the judges will be Alexei Volkov." Sophie froze at the name. Everyone in the classical music world knew Alexei Volkov, the Russian piano prodigy turned international sensation. His recordings of Rachmaninoff were legendary. His concerts sold out within minutes, and his temperament was notoriously fierce. "Volkov? He's terrifying," Sophie whispered. Mrs. Rivera chuckled. "He's demanding because he respects the music. But yes, he has high standards. Which is exactly why you should play for him. If anyone can recognize what's special about your playing, it's Volkov." Sophie's hands trembled slightly at the thought. "I don't know, Mrs. Rivera. What if I embarrass myself? What if I freeze up? Then you'll have tried, which is more than most people ever do with their dreams." Mrs. Rivera's voice softened. "The festival covers travel expenses for accepted participants. Your parents would only need to arrange accommodations." Sophie bit her lip. My parents would never agree, especially my dad. Let me worry about convincing your parents, Mrs. Rivera said. You just focus on preparing. I've chosen Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 for your performance piece. Sophie's eyebrows shot up. That's one of the most difficult pieces in the repertoire. And one of Volkov's specialties, Mrs. Rivera added. It's ambitious, yes. But if there was ever a time to be ambitious, it's now. That evening at dinner, Sophie picked at her food while her parents discussed their days. She was trying to find the right moment to mention the festival when the doorbell rang. I'll get it, her father said. Sophie heard the door open, followed by her father's surprised voice. Mrs. Rivera! What a nice surprise. Please come in. Sophie's heart pounded as she heard Mrs. Rivera's familiar footsteps enter the living room. I hope I'm not interrupting dinner, Mrs. Rivera said apologetically. Not at all. Would you like to join us? Sophie's mother offered. Thank you, but I can't stay long. I wanted to speak with both of you about an opportunity for Sophie. For the next 20 minutes, Mrs. Rivera outlined the details of the festival, emphasizing its prestige and the rare opportunity it presented. Sophie listened, holding her breath as her teacher skillfully addressed every concern her parents raised. But New York is so far, and Sophie has never traveled alone, her mother worried. The festival assigns a student liaison to each participant, Mrs. Rivera explained. They'll assist with everything from airport pickup to navigating the venue. And the expense? Her father asked, his voice tight with concern. As I mentioned, the festival covers travel. For accommodations, my sister lives in Manhattan and has offered her guest room to Sophie. She works from home and would be there if Sophie needed anything. Sophie couldn't believe how thoroughly Mrs. Rivera had planned this. Most importantly, Mrs. Rivera continued, this festival is attended by scouts from music conservatories and foundations that offer scholarships. This could open doors for Sophie's future education, practical doors, she added, emphasizing the word Sophie's father often used. A heavy silence fell over the room. Sophie held her breath. Finally, her father spoke. Sophie, is this something you really want to do? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected more resistance, more practical concerns. Yes, she said firmly, surprising herself with her conviction. Yes, it is, her father sighed. And Sophie could picture him running a hand through his hair as he did when making difficult decisions. Then we'll find a way to make it work, he said quietly. Sophie couldn't believe her ears. Really, you're okay with it? I wouldn't say I'm completely okay with it, her father admitted. I'm terrified, actually. But Mrs. Rivera is right. Opportunities like this don't come along every day. And if this is the path you're choosing, then our job is to help you walk it, not block it. The next 4 weeks passed in a blur of intensive practice. Sophie spent every free moment at the piano, working through the complex emotional landscape of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece. The piece was challenging even for seasoned pianists. Its technical demands were enormous, requiring power, speed, and delicacy in equal measure. But it was the emotional depth that Sophie found most challenging. The concerto had been Rachmaninoff's triumph after a period of devastating depression, and every note carried the weight of that journey from despair to hope. The night before her departure, Sophie sat alone at her piano, running through the piece one last time. Her fingers moved with confidence now, finding the keys without hesitation, drawing out the melody that had become part of her. That was beautiful, her father said softly from the doorway when she finished. Sophie hadn't heard him come in. Thanks, Dad. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench. I owe you an apology, Sophie. For what? For underestimating you. For focusing on what you couldn't do instead of everything you can. He took her hand in his. Your mother and I watched some videos of this Volkov character tonight, Sophie laughed. And he seems absolutely terrifying, her father admitted. But also brilliant. The way people talk about him, it's the way Mrs. Rivera talks about you. Sophie felt tears welling in her eyes. I'm scared, Dad, I know. But being scared means you're about to do something brave. He squeezed her hand. Whatever happens in New York, we're proud of you. I'm proud of you. As Sophie packed the last of her things that night, her fingers brushed against a small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside was a silver necklace with a tiny piano charm, a gift from her grandmother before she passed away. Sophie fastened it around her neck, the cool metal settling against her skin like a promise. Tomorrow she would board a plane to New York, to play on a stage bigger than any she'd ever imagined, in front of a pianist whose opinion could shape her future. The thought sent a shiver of fear and excitement down her spine. Sophie Chen, the blind girl from apartment 3B with the second-hand piano, was about to step onto a world stage. And despite her fears, despite the voice in her head listing all the ways she might fail, she was ready. The airport was a symphony of sound, announcements echoing through the terminals, the steady hum of conversations, rolling suitcases clicking against tile floors. For Sophie, who navigated the world through sound, it was overwhelming. Flight 242 to New York is now boarding at Gate 17, a voice announced over the speakers. Sophie gripped her mother's arm tighter. "That's us," her mother said gently. "Are you ready?" Sophie nodded, though her stomach was tied in knots. She'd never flown before, never left her parents for more than a night, never traveled to a city like New York. At the gate, a cheerful airline attendant took special care to explain the boarding process to Sophie. "We'll get you settled before everyone else," she explained. "And I've notified the flight crew about your needs." Sophie winced slightly at the word needs. She didn't like being treated differently, but in unfamiliar situations like this, she had to admit the help was welcome. The goodbye at the gate was harder than Sophie had expected. Her mother hugged her tight, whispering encouragements. Her father, who had been quiet all morning, finally spoke. "Remember what we practiced," he said, pressing something into her hand. It was a small voice recorder. "If you get lost or confused, press this button. It has all your information and emergency contacts." Sophie smiled, tucking the recorder into her pocket. It was so like her father to think of something practical. "I'll be fine, Dad. Mrs. Rivera's sister will be waiting for me." "I know you will," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the strongest person I know, Sophie Chen." The flight itself was less scary than Sophie had imagined. The flight attendants were kind, checking on her regularly but not hovering. The woman in the seat next to her, a music teacher from Chicago, chatted with her about composers after noticing the Braille music sheets Sophie was reviewing. "Rachmaninoff's second?" the woman asked, impressed. "That's ambitious for anyone, let alone someone your age." Sophie smiled. "It speaks to me. The way it starts so dark and ends with such triumph. It's like he's telling us that pain isn't the end of the story." The woman was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly it," she finally said. "I've been teaching that piece for 20 years, and I've never heard anyone describe it so perfectly." When the plane touched down in New York, Sophie was met at the gate by a festival volunteer named Luis. "I'll be your guide for the week," he explained, helping her navigate through the crowded terminal. "I'm a cellist in my second year at Juilliard." "Juilliard," Sophie repeated, awestruck. The prestigious music school was the dream of countless musicians. Luis laughed. "It's just a school. A good one, but still just a school. The real magic happens when you play, not where you study." He guided her outside where they caught a taxi. Mrs. Rivera's sister lives in the East Village. It's a cool neighborhood, lots of artists and musicians around. The taxi ride was an adventure in itself. Sophie rolled down the window, letting the sounds and smells of New York wash over her. Car horns, snippets of conversations in different languages, street vendors calling out to passers-by, the scent of food from countless restaurants. "It's so alive," Sophie whispered, almost to herself. "That's New York for you," Luis said, "always in motion." Mrs. Rivera's sister, Elena, lived in a narrow townhouse on a quiet street. "Sophie," she greeted warmly when Luis walked her to the door. "Welcome to New York. My sister has told me so much about you." Elena's home was cozy and compact, with a small guest room that would be Sophie's for the next week. Most importantly, there was a piano, an old upright that Elena explained had belonged to her mother. "It's not as grand as what you'll be playing on at the festival, but it's in tune," Elena said. "You're welcome to practice any time before 9 p.m. My neighbors are understanding, but they do need to sleep." That evening, after a simple dinner of pasta and salad, Sophie sat at Elena's piano, letting her fingers get used to its quirks. Each piano had its own personality, its own response to touch. This one had a warm, mellow tone, with keys that required a bit more pressure than Sophie was used to. She began to play the opening of the Rachmaninoff concerto, those famous minor chords that set the tone for the entire piece. The first movement was a battle between darkness and light, despair and hope. Sophie lost herself in it, forgetting she was in a stranger's home in an unfamiliar city. "That was lovely," Elena said when Sophie finally paused. "Different from how my sister plays it." "Different how?" Sophie asked, curious. Elena thought for a moment. "Teresa, Mrs. Rivera, plays it with technical perfection. You play it like you've lived it." Sophie didn't know how to respond to that. "Mrs. Rivera is a much better pianist than I am. Technical skill and emotional connection are different gifts," Elena said simply. "Now you should get some rest. Tomorrow is your first day at the festival and you'll need your energy." The next morning, Luis arrived early to escort Sophie to Lincoln Center, where the festival was being held. The complex was massive, housing several performance venues, rehearsal spaces, and common areas where participants could mingle. "The opening ceremony is in the main hall at 10, Luis explained as they navigated the busy corridors. "After that, there's an orientation for all participants. Your first scheduled rehearsal time is at 2 this afternoon." Sophie nodded, trying to memorize the route they were taking, the number of steps, the turns, the sounds that might help her navigate later. But it was overwhelming. Too many people, too many voices, too many unfamiliar spaces. "Don't worry," Luis said, as if reading her thoughts. "I'll be with you whenever you need me this week. That's my job." The opening ceremony was a blur of speeches and applause. Sophie sat with the other pianists, listening as the festival director welcomed everyone and introduced the judges and mentors who would be working with the young musicians. "And we are especially honored to have with us the incomparable Alexei Volkov," the director announced, his voice filled with reverence. The audience erupted in applause more enthusiastic than for any other introduction. Sophie's heart raced. Volkov was really here. "Mr. Volkov rarely participates in youth festivals," the director continued when the applause died down. "We are grateful that he has made an exception for us this year. He will be conducting master classes for our pianists and serving as head judge for the final performances." After the ceremony, Luis guided Sophie to the orientation room, where all participants received their schedules for the week. "You have a rehearsal slot every day," Luis explained as they found seats. "And there's a master class with one of the judges tomorrow." "It looks like you got—" "Oh, what?" Sophie asked, hearing the concern in his voice. "You've been assigned to Volkov's master class." Sophie's stomach dropped. "Is that bad?" Luis hesitated. "Volkov is brilliant, but he has a reputation for being tough on students. Some say he's cruel." "Great," Sophie muttered. "Hey, he wouldn't be here if he didn't want to teach," Luis reassured her. "And being chosen for his class is actually an honor. They must think very highly of your audition recording." The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions and information. Sophie met some of the other participants, pianists, violinists, cellists, and vocalists from around the world. Most were friendly, though a few seemed more interested in sizing up the competition than making friends. By the time her rehearsal slot arrived, Sophie was exhausted but eager to get her hands on the festival's piano. Luis walked her to the practice room, a small space with excellent acoustics. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," he said. "You have the room for an hour." Alone at last, Sophie took a deep breath and explored the piano. It was a concert grand, bigger than anything she'd ever played, its action lighter, more responsive than Elena's upright. She began with scales to warm up, then moved into the concerto. The piano sang under her fingers. Unlike the upright at Elena's, this instrument responded to the lightest touch, allowing for subtleties she could only dream of on lesser instruments. Sophie lost track of time as she played through the difficult passages that had given her trouble, experimenting with different approaches to the emotional climaxes of the piece. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the door open, didn't realize someone had entered until a voice cut through her playing. "Your tempo is too slow in the development section." Sophie's hands froze on the keys. The voice was male, accented, Russian. Her heart nearly stopped. The composer's intention was allegro, not adagio. The voice continued coldly. "And your left hand is overpowering the melody in measure 78. Sophie turned toward the voice, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly," the man replied. There was a long pause. "You're blind." It wasn't a question, but Sophie nodded anyway. "Yes," another pause, longer this time. "Interesting choice of piece for someone with your limitations." The word stung, but Sophie lifted her chin. Rachmaninoff didn't compose it just for people who can see. A short, humorless laugh. No, but he composed it for pianists who can master it. The second movement's polyrhythms are challenging even for those with full sight. For someone like you, they may be impossible. Sophie's cheeks burned. I can play them. Show me. Her hands trembling slightly, Sophie positioned them over the keys and began the section he had mentioned. It was one of the most technically demanding passages, with the right hand playing triplets against the left hand's duplets, creating a complex, layered texture that many pianists struggled to execute cleanly. She played it perfectly, not just technically correct, but with the emotional restraint the section required, letting the tension build gradually rather than rushing to the climax. When she finished, there was silence. Sophie waited for the man, who she was now certain must be Alexei Volkov himself, to speak. Adequate, he finally said, his tone dismissive. Though I suspect you've been coached extensively on this particular section. Before Sophie could respond, she heard footsteps approaching the door. Ah, Mr. Volkov. It was the festival director's voice, sounding surprised and slightly nervous. I see you've met Ms. Chen. She's one of the students in your master class tomorrow. Is she? Volkov replied, his tone impossible to read. How charitable of the selection committee. Sophie felt as if she'd been slapped. The implication was clear. He thought she had been chosen out of pity, not talent. Mr. Volkov, Sophie's audition recording was, the director began. I have other appointments, Volkov interrupted. Good day. Sophie heard his footsteps retreat, the door closing behind him. She sat frozen at the piano, her fingers still resting on the keys, humiliation washing over her in waves. I'm so sorry about that, Ms. Chen, the director said awkwardly. Mr. Volkov can be indirect, please don't take it personally. But how could she not? The most renowned pianist in the world had just suggested she didn't belong here, that her inclusion was charity, not merit. When the director left, Sophie remained at the piano, tears threatening to spill. Then slowly, deliberately, she placed her fingers back on the keys and began to play. Not Rachmaninoff this time, but a simple Bach prelude. The first piece she had ever mastered. A touchstone she returned to when she needed to center herself. By the time Louise came to tell her the hour was up, her resolve had hardened. Alexei Volkov thought she didn't belong on this stage. Fine. She would show him and everyone else exactly where she belonged. Sophie barely slept that night. Volkov's words kept replaying in her mind, each repetition stinging as much as the first time. Charitable, he had called her inclusion in the festival. As if she were a pity case, not a musician worthy of being there. Elena knocked softly on her door around midnight, offering chamomile tea. Bad day? She asked gently. Sophie sighed, accepting the warm mug. I met Alexei Volkov. Ah, the single syllable contained volumes of understanding. And I'm guessing he lived up to his reputation? Sophie nodded, blowing on her tea. He basically said I don't belong here. That the festival included me out of pity because I'm blind. Elena was quiet for a moment. You know, when Teresa and I were young, our piano teacher told her she'd never be good enough to perform professionally. Said her hands were too small. Sophie smiled despite herself. Mrs. Rivera had the smallest hands of any pianist she knew, yet she could stretch to reach difficult intervals through sheer determination. What did she do? She practiced 12 hours a day until she could play Liszt's hardest pieces flawlessly. Elena paused. She didn't become a concert pianist in the end, but it was her choice, not because of what some old man told her about her hands. Sophie sipped her tea. I have a master class with him tomorrow. Elena whistled. Well, that should be interesting. Try to see it as an opportunity, not a punishment. Even the harshest critics can teach us something. Morning came too quickly. Sophie dressed carefully in the outfit she and her mother had chosen for important performances. A simple blue dress with a fitted bodice and flowing skirt that wouldn't restrict her movement at the piano. Around her neck, she wore her grandmother's piano charm necklace. Louise met her at Elena's door. Ready for the master class? Volkov's reputation is making everyone nervous. I've never seen so many terrified pianists in one place. Sophie managed a weak laugh. At least I'm not the only one. The master class was held in a medium-sized recital hall. Louise guided Sophie to a seat among the other student pianists, whispering descriptions of the room to help her orient herself. There's a grand piano at the center of the stage. Volkov is sitting at the left side going through some sheet music. There are about 30 people in the audience, mostly other festival participants and some teachers. Sophie nodded, her stomach knotting with anxiety. The room buzzed with tense whispers until a sharp voice cut through them. "We will begin," Volkov announced, his accent more pronounced in the echoey space. "I will call each student to perform a short section of their chosen piece. I will critique, you will listen, then you will try again. If you cannot incorporate my suggestions immediately, perhaps reconsider your commitment to music." A collective intake of breath from the students showed Sophie wasn't alone in finding his approach intimidating. The first student was a boy from Germany playing a Beethoven sonata. He had barely completed 8 measures before Volkov interrupted. "Stop. Your touch is too heavy for Beethoven. You play like you are angry at the piano." Again, with more light, the boy tried again. This time, he made it through 16 measures before Volkov stopped him. "Better. But your phrasing makes no sense. Where is the musical line? You play notes, not music," and so it went. Each student faced similar treatment. Curt interruptions, blunt criticisms, occasional grudging approval. Some left the stage looking defeated, others determined. None escaped unscathed. "Sophie Chen," Volkov called, his pronunciation of her name slightly off. Louise squeezed her arm encouragingly as he helped her to the stage and to the piano bench. Sophie took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began the opening of the Rachmaninoff concerto. She made it through exactly 3 chords before Volkov's voice sliced through the music. "Stop." A pause. "Your posture is incorrect. You curl your shoulders as if protecting yourself from the music instead of projecting it." Sophie straightened her back, trying to loosen her shoulders. "Again," he commanded. This time she made it through the first page before he interrupted. "Your interpretation is too romantic. Rachmaninoff was not Chopin. The emotion must come from within the structure, not from excessive rubato." Sophie tried again, focusing on keeping a steadier tempo while still shaping the phrases. "Better," Volkov admitted after she completed a full page without interruption. Now the development section. Sophie moved to the more technically challenging part of the first movement, the one they had discussed the day before. She played the complex polyrhythms carefully, making sure each note was clear and precise. "Stop," Volkov said again, but his voice was different now. Less dismissive, more curious. "Play measure 78 to 92 again." Sophie did as instructed, focusing entirely on the music, letting her fingers find the patterns they had memorized through countless hours of practice. When she finished, there was silence. Sophie waited, bracing for another criticism. "How do you conceptualize the polyrhythms?" Volkov finally asked. It wasn't the cutting remark she expected. I think of them as waves," Sophie explained, her voice small in the large space. "The right hand is waves reaching the shore every 3 counts. The left hand is the tide pulling back every 2. They meet and separate, creating a natural rhythm. More silence. Then, an interesting approach. Not how I would teach it, but effective. Continue to the cadenza." Sophie moved to the virtuosic solo section near the end of the movement, where the piano takes center stage without the orchestra. It was technically demanding, requiring rapid hand crossings, huge leaps across the keyboard, and precise pedaling. She poured everything into it. All the frustration from Volkov's dismissal, all the years of practicing while other kids played outside, all the times she'd been told what she couldn't do because she couldn't see. Her fingers flew across the keys, finding each note with unerring accuracy. When she finished, the room was completely silent. Sophie sat still, waiting for the verdict, her heart pounding. "Your technique is," Volkov paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "surprisingly adequate. But you rush the climax. The audience needs time to feel the weight of each chord, again from the start of the cadenza, and give each chord its full value." Sophie nodded and began again, forcing herself to hold back, to let each massive chord resonate fully before moving to the next. It was against her instinct. She wanted to surge forward to release the tension, but she followed his instruction. "Yes," Volkov said when she finished. It was the closest thing to approval she'd heard from him. "That is how Rachmaninoff intended it." Another pause. Next student, and just like that, her turn was over. Louise helped her back to her seat, squeezing her hand. "That was amazing," he whispered. "He was actually nice to you. Well, Volkov nice, anyway." Sophie wasn't sure how to feel. She hadn't been singled out for excessive criticism, but neither had Volkov acknowledged that his initial assessment of her might have been wrong. Still, surprisingly adequate from Alexei Volkov was apparently high praise, according to the whispers around her. After the master class, a small crowd gathered around Sophie in the hallway, other pianists and a few string players, all wanting to talk about her performance. "I've never heard anyone handle those polyrhythms so cleanly," one violinist commented, and Volkov actually seemed impressed, added a pianist from South Korea. "I've watched videos of his master classes for years, and I've never seen him so restrained in his criticism." Sophie smiled, a bit overwhelmed by the attention. "He still thinks I rushed the climax." "He thinks everyone rushes everything," laughed another student. "But seriously, your playing was beautiful. How long have you been working on the Rachmaninoff?" The conversation flowed easily after that. Shop talk about difficult passages and favorite recordings. For the first time since arriving, Sophie felt like she truly belonged among these talented young musicians. They saw her as one of them, not as the blind girl, but as a fellow artist. That afternoon, Sophie had her regular rehearsal slot. Luis walked her to the practice room, chatting about the other master classes and performances scheduled for the day. "Word's getting around about your playing," he mentioned casually. "People are looking forward to your final performance." Sophie's stomach flipped. "Don't remind me. I'm nervous enough already." "You'll be amazing," Luis assured her. "After what I heard today, I'd put money on it." At the practice room, Sophie was surprised to find someone waiting for her. Professor Thompson, one of the other festival judges and a renowned piano pedagogue. "Ms. Chen," he greeted warmly. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I heard about your master class with Volkov this morning, and wondered if you might allow me to sit in on your rehearsal." Sophie hesitated. After Volkov's criticisms, the idea of another judge hearing her practice, with all the repetition, the mistakes, the experimenting, was daunting. But Professor Thompson seemed to sense her concern. "I promise I'm not here to judge," he said gently. "I'm curious about your process. And perhaps I might offer some suggestions on the second movement. It's something of a specialty of mine." His kind tone decided it. "I'd appreciate that," Sophie said sincerely. For the next hour, Sophie worked with Professor Thompson on the lyrical second movement of the concerto. Unlike Volkov's abrupt criticisms, Thompson offered thoughtful suggestions, demonstrating passages himself and explaining the historical context of certain phrases. "Rachmaninoff wrote this while recovering from a deep depression," he explained. "The second movement is like a conversation between hope and despair. The opening theme is questioning, uncertain. The middle section answers with warmth and reassurance." Sophie nodded, feeling the emotional architecture of the piece more clearly than ever. "That's why it spoke to me when I first heard it," she admitted.
"It feels like
walking through darkness but knowing there's light somewhere ahead." "Exactly," Thompson said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "That's precisely what makes your interpretation special, Ms. Chen. You understand the emotional journey. Many technically perfect pianists never grasp that." As the session ended, Professor Thompson made an unexpected offer. "The final performances begin the day after tomorrow. Would you like to run through your piece with me at the piano, playing a reduced version of the orchestral part? It might help you prepare." Sophie was stunned by the offer. "I would love that." "Thank you. Excellent. Let's arrange it for tomorrow afternoon." He paused. "And Sophie, Volkov may seem harsh, but he doesn't waste time on musicians without potential. The fact that he critiqued you at all is a good sign." After he left, Sophie remained at the piano, turning over everything that had happened. The humiliation of Volkov's initial dismissal, the tension of the master class, the unexpected support from Professor Thompson and the other students. She began to play again, not the Rachmaninoff this time, but a Chopin nocturne, something soft and reflective to help her process the swirl of emotions. "Much better suited to your abilities," a voice suddenly commented from the doorway. Volkov again, his tone impossible to read. Sophie's hands froze on the keys. "I was just taking a break," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Footsteps approached, then stopped at the side of the piano. "The Chopin is lovely, but I'm more interested in hearing how you'll approach the third movement of the Rachmaninoff tomorrow. The technical demands increase substantially." Sophie turned toward his voice, confused. "Tomorrow? I thought the final performances were the day after tomorrow." They are. But I understand Thompson has offered to run through the piece with you. I will be attending. Before Sophie could respond, Volkov turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Sophie sat motionless at the piano, her heart racing. First, Volkov had dismissed her as a charity case. Then he had offered measured critique in the master class. Now he was voluntarily coming to hear her rehearse. She didn't know what to think, but one thing was becoming clear. Alexei Volkov was taking her seriously as a musician. Whether that was good or terrifying, she wasn't entirely sure. That night, Sophie called home. Hearing her parents' voices grounded her after the emotional roller coaster of the past 2 days. "How's the festival going?" her father asked, trying to sound casual, though Sophie could hear the worry in his voice. She hesitated, wondering how much to share. "It's challenging. But good, I think. Have you met the famous pianist yet?" "The Russian one?" her mother asked. Sophie laughed, the sound tinged with nervousness. "Oh yes, we've met." She told them about the master class, carefully editing out Volkov's initial dismissal and focusing instead on the technical advice he'd given her. No need to worry them, especially when they were so far away. "And there's another judge, Professor Thompson, who's been really helpful," she added. "He's going to run through the concerto with me tomorrow, playing the orchestra part on a second piano." "That's wonderful, honey," her mother said. "It sounds like you're making quite an impression." "I don't know about that," Sophie replied, twisting the phone cord between her fingers. "But I'm learning a lot." After saying goodnight to her parents, Sophie tried to sleep, but her mind was too active. Tomorrow she would play the entire concerto with Professor Thompson, and Volkov would be there watching. The thought made her stomach churn with a mixture of fear and determination. She got up and went to the living room, where Elena's upright piano stood silent in the darkness. Not wanting to wake Elena, Sophie sat at the keyboard without playing, her fingers moving through the motions of the concerto, practicing the muscle memory without making a sound. "Can't sleep?" Elena's voice came softly from the doorway. "I didn't mean to wake you," Sophie apologized. "You didn't. I'm a night owl myself." Elena moved into the room and sat beside Sophie on the bench. "Want to talk about it?" Sophie sighed. "Tomorrow I'm playing for Professor Thompson and Alexei Volkov. I'm terrified I'll mess up." "You might," Elena said simply. "Everyone messes up sometimes. The question is, what happens after?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, the measure of a musician isn't whether they hit every note perfectly. It's whether they can recover when they don't, whether they can keep the music alive even when things go wrong." Sophie considered this. "Mrs. Rivera says something similar. She says music lives in the spaces between the notes, not just in the notes themselves." "My sister is a wise woman," Elena replied. "Now, how about some hot chocolate? Then we'll both try to get some sleep." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Luis met Sophie as usual, but she could tell something was different in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked as they walked toward Lincoln Center. "Nothing's wrong," he said quickly, then sighed. "It's just people are talking about your session with Thompson and Volkov today. Word got out that they're both attending. It's unusual for the judges to give this much attention to a single participant before the final performances." Sophie stumbled slightly. "Are people upset?" "Some are jealous," Luis admitted. "Others are just curious. A few are planning to come watch." "Watch?" Sophie stopped walking. "It's going to be an audience?" "Not officially, but there's no rule against other participants observing rehearsals. I think some of the pianists want to see how Thompson and Volkov interact with you." Great, more pressure. Just what she needed. When they arrived at the rehearsal hall, Sophie could sense the room was far from empty. The subtle sounds of breathing, the rustle of clothing, the almost imperceptible whispers told her there were at least a dozen people present. "Ms. Chen." Professor Thompson greeted her warmly. "Are you ready to work through the concerto?" Sophie nodded, trying to ignore the awareness of watching eyes as Luis guided her to the main piano. There were 2 grand pianos on the stage, one for her, one for Professor Thompson to play the orchestral reduction. "We'll start from the beginning and play through each movement," Thompson explained. "Don't worry about mistakes. This is just to get a feel for the piece with the orchestral context." Sophie positioned herself at the keyboard, took a deep breath, and began the famous opening chords. Thompson joined in, his piano providing the rich orchestral responses to her solo passages. The interaction was magical, her phrases calling out, his answering, building a musical conversation that made the piece come alive in a way it never had during her solo practice. They made it through the first movement with only minor hiccups, which Thompson smoothly covered. As they prepared to start the second movement, Sophie heard the rehearsal room door open and close, followed by familiar footsteps. "Continue," Volkov's voice commanded from somewhere at the back of the room. Sophie swallowed hard and nodded to Professor Thompson. The second movement began, its lyrical theme flowing from her fingers with a new emotional depth after yesterday's discussion of its meaning. The conversation between hope and despair unfolded, Sophie's piano singing the lonely questions, Thompson's providing the warm, comforting answers. Halfway through, Volkov's voice interrupted. "Stop." Sophie's hands froze on the keys. "The transition to the middle section," Volkov said, his footsteps approaching the stage. "It lacks conviction. You play as if you are not sure you deserve the answer to your question." Sophie frowned, trying to understand. "I'm not sure what you mean." The first theme asks, "Is there hope in darkness?" The second theme answers, "Yes, there is light." But you hesitate between them, as if you don't believe the answer. She was startled by how closely his interpretation matched her own understanding of the piece. "Try again," Volkov instructed, from 4 measures before the transition. Sophie played the passage again, this time moving more confidently into the hopeful middle section. "Better," Volkov said. Now the third movement. The final movement was the most technically challenging. A whirlwind of notes, dramatic dynamic shifts, and triumphant themes that required both power and delicacy. Sophie had practiced it endlessly, but playing it with the orchestral part was a different experience entirely. She had to listen carefully to Thompson's piano, to time her entrances and balance her dynamics against the simulated orchestra. Despite the pressure, Sophie found herself enjoying the challenge. There was something liberating about playing with another musician, about being part of something larger than her solo performance. The music carried her forward, each phrase leading naturally to the next, building toward the concerto's triumphant conclusion. When they reached the final cadenza, the virtuosic solo section near the end, Sophie poured everything she had into it. Her hands flew across the keyboard, finding the complex patterns without hesitation. The massive chords that had once seemed impossible now resonated with confidence and power. The room disappeared, the audience forgotten. There was only the music. The final chords rang out, powerful and definitive, answered by Thompson's piano with equal force. Then silence. Sophie sat motionless, her hands still resting on the keys, her heart pounding. She waited for Volkov's criticism, for the cutting remark about what she had done wrong. Instead, she heard soft applause from around the room, quickly growing stronger. The other students who had come to watch were clapping, hesitantly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. "Well," Professor Thompson said, his voice warm with approval, "I believe we're ready for tomorrow, don't you?" Before Sophie could respond, Volkov spoke. "The octave passage at measure 241 was uneven. And you are still rushing the final sequence of chords, of course." Sophie nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. "But," Volkov continued, surprising her, "the interpretation is compelling. You understand what Rachmaninoff was trying to say. That is rare, especially in one so young." Coming from Volkov, it was practically a standing ovation. Sophie felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me," Volkov replied, his tone returning to its usual crispness. "Prove yourself tomorrow on stage when it matters." With that, he turned and left, his footsteps fading down the corridor. The room immediately burst into excited chatter, students approaching to congratulate Sophie and ask questions about the piece. Later, as Luis walked her back to Elena's apartment, he was practically bubbling with excitement. "You should have seen their faces when you played that final movement. And did you hear what Volkov said? Compelling. I've never heard him use that word for a student before." Sophie smiled, still processing everything that had happened. "He also said I was rushing and uneven. That's just Volkov being Volkov. Trust me. If he didn't think you were exceptional, he wouldn't bother criticizing the details. He'd just dismiss you entirely." They walked in silence for a moment before Luis added, "People are talking about you being a contender for the top prize tomorrow." Sophie stumbled slightly. "The prize?" I hadn't even thought about that, it was true. She'd been so focused on proving herself to Volkov, on showing she deserved to be at the festival, that she'd forgotten about the competition aspect entirely. The top prize winner would receive a scholarship to the music school of their choice and a chance to perform with a professional orchestra. Don't think about it, Luis advised. Just play the way you did today, and whatever happens, happens. That evening, Elena helped Sophie pick out an outfit for her performance, a long, midnight blue dress with short sleeves that wouldn't restrict her movement. Teresa, Mrs. Rivera called while you were at rehearsal, Elena mentioned as she helped Sophie try on the dress. She'll be watching the live stream of the finals tomorrow. She's very proud of you. Sophie's throat tightened. I wish she could be here. She's here in spirit, Elena assured her. And your parents will be watching online too. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Everyone who mattered to her would be watching, even if from a distance. After dinner, Sophie sat at the piano one last time, not to practice the Rachmaninoff, but to play a simple Mozart sonata, clean, structured, and calming. The familiar notes settled her nerves, reminding her why she loved music in the first place. Later in bed, Sophie lay awake, her mind too full for sleep. Tomorrow she would perform on the main stage at Lincoln Center, in front of an audience and a panel of judges, including Alexei Volkov. A week ago, the thought would have paralyzed her with fear. Now, though, alongside the nervousness was a new feeling, anticipation. She thought of how the music had flowed today when she played with Professor Thompson, how right it had felt. For a few transcendent moments, she hadn't been the blind pianist or the girl with limitations. She had simply been a musician, speaking Rachmaninoff's language, telling his story through her fingers. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had already won something valuable, the knowledge that she belonged in this world. That her music deserved to be heard. Sophie touched the piano charm around her neck, thinking of her grandmother who had given it to her, of Mrs. Rivera who had believed in her enough to submit her recording, of her parents who had supported her despite their worries. I won't let you down, she whispered to herself in the darkness. With that promise, she finally drifted to sleep, her dreams filled with music. The morning of the final performance dawned bright and clear. Sophie woke early, her heart already racing with anticipation. She could hear Elena moving around in the kitchen, the gentle clink of cups and plates, the rich aroma of coffee filling the apartment. Big day, Elena said when Sophie emerged from her room, already dressed in comfortable clothes for the morning. Her performance outfit hung carefully in the closet, ready for later. Biggest of my life, Sophie agreed, accepting a mug of tea. Her stomach was too knotted for food, but the warm drink was soothing. Any special rituals before a performance? Elena asked. Sophie smiled. Mrs. Rivera always has me play Bach. She says it centers the mind and warms up the fingers without tiring them. Sounds like Teresa, Elena laughed. Well, the piano's all yours. I'll make myself scarce. For the next hour, Sophie lost herself in the mathematical precision of Bach's well-tempered clavier. The intricate patterns and perfect structures calmed her nerves, focusing her mind on the pure mechanics of playing. No drama, no emotion, just clean, precise technique. Luis arrived to escort her to Lincoln Center earlier than usual. They want all the finalists there for sound checks and last-minute instructions, he explained. The performance order was posted last night. When am I playing? Sophie asked as they navigated the busy sidewalks. Luis hesitated. You're last. Sophie's heart sank a little. Being last meant sitting through all the other performances, the tension building with each one. It also meant the judges would be comparing her to everyone who came before. Is that bad? She asked. It can be good, Luis replied thoughtfully. The last performer leaves the strongest impression. And the fact that they placed you last often means they expect something special. When they reached Lincoln Center, the atmosphere was electric. The final performances were open to the public and a sizable audience was expected. Technicians bustled about, checking microphones and adjusting lights. The other finalists milled around nervously, some practicing silently on tabletops, others sitting in quiet meditation. The festival director gathered them all for a briefing, explaining the schedule and procedures. Each of you will have approximately 5 minutes for final preparation on stage before your performance, he explained. Use this time to adjust the bench, get comfortable with the piano, and center yourself. Remember that the judges are evaluating not just your technical skill, but your musicality, your interpretation, and your stage presence. Sophie nodded along with the others, trying to commit everything to memory. 5 minutes on stage before playing. Adjust the bench. Get comfortable with the piano. Center yourself. The audience is already beginning to arrive, the director continued. Please remain in the green room until your performance time. There's a monitor so you can watch the other performers if you wish. The finalists were escorted to the green room, a comfortable lounge with couches, chairs, and a large screen showing the stage. Sophie found a quiet corner and sat, trying to keep her breathing steady and her mind clear. One by one, the other musicians were called to perform. Sophie listened carefully to each one, impressed by their skill and musicality. A violinist from Japan played a hauntingly beautiful Sibelius concerto. A cellist from Brazil performed Bach with extraordinary depth. The pianists were especially intimidating. A young man from Germany played Beethoven's Emperor Concerto with technical brilliance, while a woman from Canada brought delicate sensitivity to a Chopin concerto. As the performances continued, Sophie felt her anxiety growing. These musicians were exceptional. How could she possibly measure up? The doubt she thought she'd overcome began to creep back in. Maybe Volkov had been right initially. Maybe she didn't belong on this stage. You're overthinking, Louise whispered, noticing her distress. Don't compare yourself to them. Your connection to the music is different. Special. Sophie nodded, grateful for his support but still uncertain. As the second-to-last performer was called to the stage, a stagehand approached her. Ms. Chen, you're next. If you'll come with me, we'll get you positioned for your preparation time. Sophie stood, smoothing her midnight blue dress with suddenly trembling hands. This was it, the moment everything had been leading to. Luis walked with her to the edge of the stage. You're going to be amazing, he whispered. Just play the way you did yesterday. Play from your heart. Sophie took a deep breath and nodded. The stagehand gently took her arm to guide her to the waiting area just off stage. From this close, she could hear the audience's applause as the previous performer finished. The sound was immense, rolling through the hall like a wave. How many people were out there? Hundreds, thousands. Sophie Chen, the announcer's voice called, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, accompanied by the festival orchestra under the direction of Maestro Williams. A real orchestra. That was new. In rehearsal, it had just been Professor Thompson on the second piano. Now she would be playing with dozens of musicians. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. The stagehand guided her onto the stage where a gentle hand, Professor Thompson's, met hers. The piano is straight ahead about 15 steps, he said softly. I'll be conducting the orchestra. Just listen for our cues and we'll follow yours. Trust the music, Sophie. She nodded, finding her way to the piano and the bench, hearing the subtle sounds of the audience. A cough here, a whispered comment there, the rustle of programs. As she adjusted the bench and placed her hands on the keys to feel the action of this particular piano, she could sense the collective anticipation in the room. Sophie closed her eyes. Not that it made a difference to her, but it helped her focus inward. She thought of her grandmother's piano charm hanging around her neck. She thought of Mrs. Rivera's belief in her. She thought of her parents watching from home. She thought of Elena's words about music living in the spaces between the notes, and, unexpectedly, she thought of Volkov. Of his dismissal, his criticism, and his grudging acknowledgement of her talent. Wherever he was sitting among the judges, she knew his standards would be impossibly high. Good, she would meet them. The hall fell silent. Professor Thompson must have raised his baton. Sophie placed her hands in position for the opening chords, took a deep breath, and began. The famous opening chords rolled forth, dark and resonant. The orchestra responded with the melancholy first theme. Sophie's fingers found each note with precision, her body swaying slightly with the emotional current of the music. All the hours of practice, all the guidance from her teachers, all her own innate understanding of the piece flowed together into something greater than its parts. She wasn't thinking anymore. Not about Volkov. Not about the judges. Not even about the notes themselves. She was inside the music now, living it rather than performing it. The first movement built to its dramatic climax, her hands spanning huge intervals without hesitation, her timing perfectly synchronized with the orchestra. As she moved into the lyrical second movement, Sophie could feel the audience's attention intensifying. The questioning theme that opened the movement seemed to hang in the air, a musical expression of uncertainty and hope. When the answer came in the middle section, Sophie put all her heart into it, making the piano sing with a voice that was almost human. The transition to the third movement came with barely a pause. Sophie launched into the energetic theme, each note crystal clear despite the rapid tempo. The orchestra matched her pace, the two entities, soloist and ensemble, pushing each other forward like partners in a dance. When the final cadenza arrived, the virtuosic solo section near the end, Sophie unleashed everything she had been holding back. Her fingers flew across the keys in a controlled frenzy, the massive chords shaking the hall, the delicate passages singing out with bell-like clarity. She was no longer playing the piano. She was using it to speak directly to every person in the audience. The concerto built to its triumphant conclusion. Orchestra and piano together proclaiming the final resolution of all the struggles presented throughout the piece. The last chords rang out, powerful and definitive. Sophie's hands lifted from the keyboard, still shaped to the final notes. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then a single person began to clap. The sound was joined by another and another, until the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause. Sophie sat motionless at the piano, overwhelmed by the wave of sound washing over her. She heard people standing, the subtle sound of seats folding up, of bodies shifting. A standing ovation. The applause continued, growing impossibly louder. Someone was shouting, "Bravo!" Others joined in, the calls multiplying. Professor Thompson appeared at her side, taking her hand to help her stand and bow. "Extraordinary," he whispered in her ear. "Simply extraordinary." Sophie bowed, tears pricking at her eyes. The applause showed no signs of stopping. Professor Thompson guided her through another bow, then gestured to the orchestra to stand and receive their share of the appreciation. "They're still applauding for you," he said after a moment. "You should take another bow." Sophie did, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This moment, this was what she had worked for all her life without even knowing it. Not the applause itself, but the connection it represented. Her music had touched these people. They had heard her. As she was escorted off stage, various hands reached out to touch her arm, to squeeze her shoulder, to offer congratulations. Fellow competitors, stage crew, festival staff, all with words of praise. "The judges are deliberating now," the festival director told her. "Please wait in the green room. The results will be announced shortly." Sophie nodded, still dazed from the experience. Luis found her and guided her to a seat. That was... He seemed at a loss for words. "Sophie, I've never heard anything like it." The way the audience responded. "I've been working these festivals for years and I've never seen a reaction like that." Before she could respond, the door to the green room opened. Familiar footsteps approached. "Volkov." "Ms. Chen," he said formally. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to hear what the famously critical pianist would say. Sophie turned toward his voice. "Mr. Volkov." There was a pause, longer than was comfortable. Then, "I owe you an apology." Sophie blinked, certain she had misheard. "When we first met," Volkov continued, his accented voice uncharacteristically soft, "I made assumptions about your abilities. Those assumptions were wrong. Profoundly wrong." The room was so quiet Sophie could hear the ticking of a clock on the wall. "What you did on that stage today was not just good playing. It was artistry of the highest order. You found the soul of Rachmaninoff's music, something many pianists spend a lifetime seeking and never find." Sophie's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "No," Volkov replied. "Thank you for reminding an old cynical man why music matters." His footsteps retreated, the door opening and closing as he left. The room remained silent for several heartbeats before erupting into excited whispers. "Did that just happen?" Luis asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Did Alexei Volkov just apologize to someone?" Sophie laughed, a sound of pure joy and relief. "I think he did." The festival director's voice came over the speaker system, calling all finalists back to the stage for the awards ceremony. Luis guided Sophie through the corridors back to the stage where the thunderous applause began again as soon as she appeared. What happened next would change Sophie's life forever. But in her heart, she had already received the prize that mattered most, the knowledge that her music played through her fingers had the power to move hearts and change minds.